the Genesis in the Bible. In the beginning was the Spirit, and it was from this Spirit that the material abundance of creation issued forth. But progress is not foreordained. The key is freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of information, freedom of communication. Freedom is the right to question and change the established way of doing things. It is the continuing revolution of the marketplace. It is the right to put forth an idea scoffed at by the experts and watch it catch fire among the people. God bless you.
We are the masters of our fate. That the task which has been set us is not above our strength. That its pangs and toils are not beyond our endurance. As long as we have faith in our cause and an unconquerable willpower, salvation will not be denied us.
Liberty is not built on the doctrine that a few nobles have a right to inherit the earth. No! No! By the unalterable, indefeasible laws of God and nature, as well entitled to the benefit of the air to breathe, light to see, food to eat, and clothes to wear as the nobles or the king. That is liberty. And liberty will reign in America.
Welcome to PoliticalVindication.com on the air, brought to you by the CB Media Network. My name is Frank, and I'm here with Shane, and like we do every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we're here to do our part to make the reign of Barack Hussein Obama a one-term phenomenon. Tonight, we welcome David Satter, author of the book It Was a Long Time Ago, and It Really Never Happened Anyways, Russia and the Communist Path. Mr. Satter will be here to talk about the turbulent history of the Russian people and their attempts to deal with the murderous history of their nation throughout the reign of the Soviet Empire. Mr. Satter will join us in just a few minutes.
We are back. Frank, thank you so much stepping in for me as well there, too. We have David Satter on the line with us here. Mr. Satter, we are so appreciative of you coming on to talk about your book. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, I'm happy to be with you.
Now, your book. This is your third book on Russia. The other two are awesome. I have them ordered on Amazon. I'm waiting for them. This book, though, the third here, it was a long time ago, and it never happened anyway. Russia and its communist past. Now, it's a touchy subject with Russians, sir, and your book makes that very clear. And the lack of memorials around that country to deal with, which was a horrifying evil in that country.
Yeah.
They're played by its government on its people. And I want to start out, Mr. Satter, before I kind of go through some of your chapters and work through this, I want you to paint us a picture, the day in the life of a Russian during communism. During Stalin's time, I should even.
Well, those are different tasks, because during Stalin's time it was quite different than during, for example, Brezhnev's time or Gorbachev's time. During Stalin's time, people really lived in terror, and people were afraid. I'll give you an example. I ran into, many years ago, a woman the wife of the American ambassador to Russia at the time during the Stalin terror, and I asked her if she knew any Russians, and she said, if you approached Russians on the street in those years, they scattered like mice. They were that afraid. People were afraid even to speak to their friends for fear that they would immediately be denounced. It was an atmosphere that's very hard for Americans to imagine. People stayed up all night because the arrests came at night, and they listened. The NKVD, which was the secret police, had special boots that had cleats on the heels, and people would stay up at night listening for the sound of those cleats on the stairway. and the sound of the elevator. And if at 2, 3 in the morning they could hear the noise of the elevator beginning to move, they were just paralyzed with fear, and they waited literally breathless for the elevator to move up beyond their floor. That meant that one of the neighbors was being arrested, not them. It's we live in a country where people often become extremely emotional and aggravated over issues that would seem to Russians to be trivial. But maybe that's the great blessing that the founding fathers of the United States conferred on all of us. They answered all the fundamental questions in a positive way and allowed us to fight over details. And but that wasn't the case in Russia.
Mr. Satter, this is Frank, the other half of Political Vindication Radio. I want to thank you for joining us today. I guess thank you. I guess when we kind of look at the history, especially from an American perspective, we always associate socialism with tyranny, and so to us, it's when we look at Stalin's era and his great purge of his own people, it comes as no surprise because the two, socialism and tyranny, seem to go hand in hand if you look at throughout the course of history. But in Russia, you talk about there was a certain satisfaction with communism. You say that in your book. They were satisfied. It was this pride of being part of a great empire. What was the appeal of communism to the everyday Russian during that era?
Well, it depends what era, once again, that we're talking about. During the Stalin era, people were so terrorized that they compensated for the fear that they felt with ideological enthusiasm. There was safety in conformity to a certain extent, or so many people believed. And people were encouraged to delude themselves into thinking that the country was surrounded by enemies, that there were spies and saboteurs everywhere, and that the leadership of the country was doing everything possible, on the contrary, to build a better tomorrow. Well, after the era of mass terror came to an end with the death of Stalin, people were still a little bit afraid, but the danger to the average citizen from the KGB was greatly reduced. Yes, you had to be careful what you said in public, you had to appear to be loyal and so on, but if you didn't actively oppose the regime, you could pretty much live your life peacefully without having any unexpected trips to the secret police or to the local KGB prison. Under those circumstances, there was nonetheless also safety and conformity, and it was much easier for a Soviet citizen to be happy and to agree with the regime that he was happy than it was to oppose the regime. After all, you have to remember, this is a country with closed borders. People cannot leave. It's a country in which there's one employer, only the government. You can't work for anyone else. It's a country in which everything is organized under the domination of one political party, the Communist Party, and in which the media is totally controlled and gives the impression that the entire population of 300 million people is unanimous. Well, faced with that kind of political, police, and psychological pressure, it takes a kind of rare person to say, well, I don't agree with this. I reject this. I don't believe that you're allowing me any liberty. And most people, once again, with the tradition of terror in the back of their minds, conformed. At the same time, the society that was created in the Soviet Union was a welfare state. It was a welfare state on what we would consider to be a fairly low level, but it offered free medical care to everyone, free education to everyone, and everybody was employed. Of course, they were employed sometimes just doing nonsense work, and it was economically very senseless, and it dragged down the whole level, the standard of living for the whole country. But nonetheless, it was as if they had put the entire population on welfare, and housed them in public housing, and people didn't have to work very hard, and here's the really sort of complicating factor in the whole situation. They encouraged people to think of each other as comrades and kind of brothers, and a genuine spirit of cooperation tended to develop. It was, of course, a cooperation without morality. It was kind of the cooperation of the herd. But nonetheless, people would often help each other in various ways and cooperate with each other, as long as one person didn't try to express himself as an individual or to achieve something that the others hadn't achieved. It was cooperation based on leveling, on people being content to be part of a herd, to live at a very low level, but to have all decisions made for them. And under those circumstances, a lot of people were actually happy.
Yeah, in fact, your conversation, Mr. Satter, with Yuri Zagulkin in Chapter 5 in there, and he said something interesting. I want to read it real quick here because it kind of goes to the heart of things. You asked, did anyone talk about the Stalin-era terror? And he says, I didn't hear about it except from my mother. The attitude was that there was no point in discussing it. There was the cult of personality. During the cult of personality, there were certain abuses. That was it. Nobody knew the extent of the repression because nobody had read Solzhenitsyn at that time. Then you asked, did people fear the evils of capitalism? Did they feel they were lucky to live under socialism? And he answers, I think you should realize that on a primitive level, life is the same everywhere. When an average person goes to work, he or she is dealing with the same set of problems. You have your boss, you have your colleagues. Life there was a real life. It wasn't cartoonish. What the regime was telling its people and telling the world was cartoonish, but within that cartoon, people were living a normal life. I think that's what you ask him, and he says exactly. That's why some people miss that kind of life. There is a nostalgia, Mr. Satter, for that you can't call it communist utopia because there was nothing utopian about it, but that socialist movement toward communism there that people miss today.
There was a nostalgia for the days when everyone was taken care of at a low level, that when no one had to think, you were told what to think, everyone dressed the same, lived the same, and you were also told that you were far from being oppressed. You were the vanguard of humanity. You were part of a movement that was going to liberate the whole planet. So a mythology was created for you, which was very easy for you to buy into because you had no alternative. And as long as you were willing to live in a kind of psychological and physical cage and were happy with that, there was no reason why you couldn't get along fine.
Well, so that pride, that ingrained pride then leads people or creates a population willing to die for it, but also willing to kill for it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And it's also, the thing is that when people are organized into collectives, when people are treated as if, no individual is different from any other, individual human life becomes relatively unimportant. I mean, it's almost, people almost revert to members of a herd. And if you eliminate part of the herd, well, the herd is still there. Who cares? And this is why in every situation where the society had to take steps to protect people. They and to value their lives, and even to sacrifice its own immediate objectives in order to preserve their lives. The Soviet regime opted, to sacrifice those lives, and that tradition has been carried out. Still exists in present-day Russia. Nothing has changed. The individual has no importance. The only thing that matters are the goals of the regime. The individual is organized in order to realize those goals. And that was really what was so insidious. There was a riot at a soccer game in 1982, and people. I don't know if it was a riot. There was an accident or some kind of panic, and hundreds of people were trampled and killed in the rush to the exits because they only had one door open for security reasons. It was a kind of mania in the Soviet Union that in an airport, in a public place, where there were a dozen doors, all the 11 were locked and only one was left open. It was the psychology of control, and when this happened, I only learned about it many years later. There were rumors in Moscow that something terrible had happened, but no details, and no information was released because, after all, if you're dealing with members of a herd, why do they need information? It's the interests of the state that count, and so this is the insidious part of it, that morality, moral judgment is the quality of an individual. It's not the quality of a mass. And what the communist authorities did once the Stalin period was over was they organized people into a mass. They deprived them of the ability to have any influence over their lives, in the broad sense, and they guaranteed them certain minimal conditions at a very low level. It's true, but nonetheless they did, and they reduced people to, in effect, dependent, unthinking, sometimes good-natured slaves.
Screws in the machine.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. We are talking to David Satter, author of the book It Was a Long Time Ago and It Never Happened Anyway, Russia and the Communist Past. Mr. Satter, I want to skip forward to Chapter 7 of your book, The Trial of the Communist Party, and trying to get a grip of sort of the history and trying to bring back sort of this nation and its history and try to tie it all together. I'd like to talk to you about the informers, and there's this big debate you talk about in your book about what to do with these spies and the informers that spied on their very neighbors and turned them into communist party thugs. How, again, the threat of informers, obviously, you talked about it earlier, how the people were scared, especially in the era of Stalin, but how you take a nation that had neighbors spying on one another, squealing on one another, whether it was for profit, whether it was for honor, living under the Soviet system, and you now start to commune these people in harmony once again. Is that ever possible?
Well, in Russia, the people who were the informers were never exposed, and the phenomenon was so widespread. I mean, that people speculate about who was an informer and who wasn't. When the wall came down in Germany, the East Germans opened up the files, and it had a very traumatic effect on the population because, there were cases where wives found that their husbands were informing on them, lovers informed on each other, relatives, friends, lifelong friends. But once it was over, it had a purifying effect on the society. Of course, it was devastating in many individual cases. Whereas in Russia, all those secrets are still kept, and there was no catharsis in that respect. And as a result, the stage is set for those people to again become part of such a structure, and again take part in that kind of massive internal spying.
There's no accountability held in the Soviet Union. That trial should have been, Mr. Satter, painful, as you say, and terrible and tragic for many. But those are wounds that can only be cauterized by that kind of searing insight and openness. It hasn't happened in Russia. That trial was a sham, correct, in 1992?
It was misconceived. I would put it that way. Maybe it wasn't intended to be a sham from the very beginning, but it ended up being useless. It ended up being useless, and in this respect, we can look at present-day Germany, and the Germans. Whatever you can say about the horrors of Nazism, Germany today is a country which has fully faced what happened, and they don't spare themselves. But as a result of having done this, they have squeezed the poison out of their society, and because there's nothing that it can truly be said now, I think, of Germany that they are not hiding anything. They really are, and it's very difficult to face what they had to face. So I think that in the case of Russia, for it to have a democratic future, which is what we all hope for Russia, we want Russia and the Russian people to have the kind of decent society that they deserve in many ways. It's necessary to go through the same process.
We're speaking with David Satter, who's talking about his book Russia and its Communist Past here. The Trial of the Communist Party is an excellent chapter because you get to hear from those people that were sent to labor camps. You hear about the lists. And in your chapter number 8, one of my favorites, Moral Choice Under Totalitarianism, another terrible dilemma within this system, in this society, this civilization is dealing with this here. And you talk about Molotov and Malenkov and Kaganovich and the authorizations of executions for people that did nothing, and in many cases were people that they knew. People that they worked with, even here.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's a kind of a callousness, a moral callousness, and as you work through this chapter, which is wonderfully written, here and I'll read this one part here, and I love your thought on it here. Representatives of Memorial argue that Kuznetsov had to have known that the accused were innocent because the NKVD handed down quotas for arrests. Mikoyan, however, disagreed. It was necessary to know the NKVD's methods, and not everyone knew them. Only the NKVD knew about the quotas. There was a kind of madness. It cannot now be understood by normal people. The NKVD at the time was like an insane asylum. People in the party did not know the scale of the repression. They thought that perhaps there were some innocent people, but they could not imagine that no one was guilty.
Yeah. This is the technique of the big lie. If you tell a lie, a small lie, you'll get caught out on it. But if you tell a lie that's so monstrous that it almost defies imagination, people assume that it, at least to some extent has to be true. This is also the technique, needless to say, that Hitler used in his accusation against the Jews. Stalin and the Russian leadership invented this imaginary enemy, and then they began arresting people and killing them as if they had really committed some crime. And the tragic thing is that Russia, because it may face something like this again in the future, doesn't really understand the need to renounce totally this type of political behavior.
So what is the difference between Germany and Russia? Germany has come to admit its crimes of the past, it seems, and it lives, I think, with a guilt in many respects, the German people. What has been the reluctance in Russia, especially for the government, Mr. Tatter, to come out and sort of accept the genocidal past and the crimes of the past?
Well, for one thing, Germany was a defeated country. It was thoroughly defeated and then occupied. And the Hitler regime was destroyed, and the new government in Germany is a normal democratic government. Whereas in Russia, the communist regime collapsed, but it was replaced not by really a democratic government, but by a group of people who called themselves Democrats and were really former communists, and a society in which people for 3 generations at least had become accustomed to the communist way of life. At the same time, and this is, I think, is very important to bear in mind, Nazism and communism have been compared, and they have a lot in common, but they're also different in certain respects. Nazism was openly cannibalistic. Hitler cobbled together an ideology based on the notion that human beings should take their examples for moral behavior from the animal world, and that that maximum ruthlessness was and cruelty was actually something positive because it purified the race. Communism never said anything like that. Communism claimed to be proclaiming brotherhood for everyone. Communism didn't say that we're going to exterminate, this or that race or even economic group. They said that there's a dying class that's going to be superseded by a progressive class, which will be the class of the entire people, and will burst apart the fetters on production and usher in an era of unprecedented wealth and prosperity and peace and brotherhood. So, although the tactics were the same, the ideals and the image of the future society were very different. And as a result of that, many people were fooled by the communists, not just in the outside world, but in Russia itself. And the fact is that once, in the case of Nazism, once the Jews had been destroyed completely, in Hitler's mind, the extermination machine would continue. It would then begin it would then focus on Poles and other people of Slavic descent. It would destroy the mentally ill. And then finally it would even begin to winnow out Germans who were not fit to be part of the master race. It was a prescription for continuous murder. Whereas in the case of the communists, once they had established their society, in which was completely monolithic and totalitarian, and in which there was no private property, they were not interested any longer in continuing to kill. They were perfectly ready to do so as long as they as they felt they needed to create this utopia. But killing wasn't really what they were interested in doing. And as a result of that, many people who grew up in the period after Stalin died, when the terror was greatly reduced, and it was just a question of occasional repression, and who lived the life of kind of, welfare recipients who didn't have to do much work, who were guaranteed, their very modest standard of living, but it was guaranteed reliably. They didn't grow up with the sense of communism being a kind of existential horror, partially because they were separated from the crimes by a generation from the crimes that created it, partially because they also were aware of some of the advantages, particularly for people who were not interested in being individuals. And that's actually, in any society, a fairly large number. So that sense, whereas the Germans, when they came back to their senses and saw what it was that they had been part of, were normal enough to react with horror. The Russians, after generations of processing under communism, of course, recognize at some level that there were crimes, but offer all kinds of explanations for why communism was not so bad.
Yeah, you talk about it in the roots of the communist idea, and I have to tell you, as we kind of swing toward what I want your thoughts, Mr. Satter, on Russia today, but just in getting that, it's very difficult for folks like myself with the shallow knowledge of Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn, who defend Russia through this and its history. Shalvarovich, Cotter, that's in here that you write about in chapter 9 too as well, that seek to equivocate is maybe not the correct word, explain away what needed to happen, because there is a certain yearning for an authoritarian figure, a dictatorial figure, and that needs to happen because the Russians, by some of these leading thinkers, and this guy Kadyrov, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Shadev, does not have a high view of the Russian, kind of sees the Russian as almost a beast of burden that needs to be led. And so if you're going to succumb to an authoritarian regime, and the authoritarian regime does terrible things, well, what did you expect? Sometimes it needs to do that, they say. Sometimes that needs to happen. But it's all for the greater cause. We're all moving in the same direction. We're trying to get to the same place. We're doing something nobody else is doing in there. And so very enlightening too. Sir, I want to, as we kind of wrap up this interview, we're coming to the end of our time with you. Putin. Vladimir Putin, there is demonstrations in the streets right now in Russia. There's a presidential election coming up in a few months. We're hearing a lot about Gorbachev right now. We're hearing a lot about Russia in the news. Are you optimistic for Russia? Since in your book, what I get from you, sir, is that since there are no memorials and no honest discussion about the past, the dark past of Russia, will things change at all? Are you optimistic for Russia today?
I think Russia has a second chance. I think that the first chance was, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union. They had a chance to establish democracy and didn't do it. Now people are protesting against the abuses, and there's a second chance. And I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful. We just have to hope that things don't go wrong a second time. But in order for that to happen, it's very important for Russians, I think, to realize that the individual has value, and that the individual human personality and the right of people to live and to express themselves those are the values upon which a decent society and a democratic society is based. And the notion, which is so prevalent in Russia, that the individual doesn't matter, that he can be sacrificed for the greater good of the state, is destructive and really is at the heart of all of Russia's historical tragedy.
We've been talking with David Satter, author of the book. It was a long time ago, and it never happened anyway, Russia and its Communist Past. Sir, thank you so much for your contribution to a conversation that, I dare say, 1,000 years ago and 1,000 years in the future, this is a topic that all human beings should be discussing with themselves. It's that important.
Well, I think so too, and I was delighted to be part of your program.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay,
Thank you.
All the best to you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye.
That's Mr. Satter over at the Hudson Institute. You see the link in the chat room, friend, to his Amazon page. I'm putting the link up to the Hudson Institute. He's a senior fellow. This guy was a Moscow correspondent for the London Financial Times. He joined the Wall Street Journal editorial page as a special correspondent on Soviet affairs, a wealth of knowledge and wisdom. We are richer for having someone delve into these issues and try to explain them, because apparently the Russians aren't doing it. There's lessons to be learned. The lessons that Russia learns, apparently they're still trying to find that, but we can learn from them, and that's why it's so valuable. And I really hope that all of you go out and get this book, take the time to read what he's got to say. America needs to be reminded here. I don't ever want to have to go through it in our country. Political vindication. To vindicate the convictions that ensure liberty, respect life, and honor tradition. But not all convictions are equal. We've seen a nation that revolted for its freedom forget that we are born free and choose to abandon that dignity. We've learned that progressivism isn't progress, and liberalism has nothing to do with liberty. So we must fight to regain what we've lost, to live by the convictions that reject paternalism, embrace capitalism, and define man as more than a Pavlovian beast. Political Vindication Radio, every Tuesday from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern, where conservatives Frank and Shane talk politics and interview best-selling authors and activists. It's 2 hours of some of today's brightest minds discussing culture, history, and politics. This nation cannot remain great if its people aren't. That's why we're here every Tuesday. We've got to bring more than hope and regret into the future. Political Vindication Radio. It's where patriots meet.